Today is the 40th anniversary of Operation Bluestar. In case you don't know what Operation Bluestar is, on this day, the Indian Army entered the Golden Temple to neutralize Khalistani terrorists who had fortified the complex. In the military operations that followed, 83 soldiers and nearly 500 civilians were killed. Operation Bluestar remains India's single bloodiest insurgency-related death toll. But the embers from Bluestar continue to flicker 40 years later. Amritpal Singh, a radical Sikh preacher espousing Khalistan in 2024, has just won a Lok Sabha seat in the 2024 Lok Sabha elections. Sarabjit Singh, the son of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's assassin, Beant Singh, is also a member of parliament in the Lok Sabha. But could Operation Bluestar have been avoided? Because just 5 months before the Indian Army entered the Golden Temple, there was another operation that had been rejected by the government, Operation Sundown, a commando-style operation to capture Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. And joining me to discuss this is my colleague Deepak Bhadsna, who's been looking very closely at the Khalistan-related stories on News9 Plus. Over to you, Deepak.
It's 40 years now, sir, but embers of this movement still somehow survive. And today, some of the most prominent of them are members of the Indian Parliament.
Yes, imagine that. Two people who you least expected to be in Parliament. Amritpal Singh, the story that you did following Khalistan revival, the Khalistan
the Khalistan reborn story.
The Khalistan reborn story is a member of Parliament. He's in prison right now in Assam. But you have, on the other hand, Beant Singh's killer's son. Remember, he's done nothing wrong, of course. He just happened to be born to Beant Singh's house. But the plank that he fought these elections for was the fact that he was the son of Indira Gandhi's assassin.
Yeah.
And his father assassinated Indira Gandhi. He was a police bodyguard. He was a sub-inspector of police. He was an inspector who was meant to protect the Prime Minister. But because Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had ordered Operation Bluestar, on the 31st of October, they shot her dead. And he is playing on that legacy, reminding the hardliners in Punjab that he's the son of Indira Gandhi's assassin. And that's how he got elected.
You know, it's just surprising. When you look at the history of Punjab, it seems to be a series of mistakes, missed chances. I believe Operation Sundown is yet another one of those things that one can only wonder what could have been had that taken place.
Yes, absolutely. So Operation Sundown, for those of you not familiar with it, was an operation that was planned by the government in late 1983. And this was meant to kidnap Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale while he was in one of those hostels around the Golden Temple, near the Golden Temple. That's where he would hold the darshans, and that's when the killings had already begun in Punjab.
He'd set up his own darbar.
He'd set up a darbar and he'd be flanked by, bodyguards, and very clearly at that time, this movement had begun gathering momentum. And that's when the government came up with this plan to capture Bhindranwale before it was too late. And so they reached out to the UK, to the SAS specifically. It was actually MI6 that they first reached out to, and they said, listen, we are planning this special forces operation. Could you help us plan it? And the SAS, which is the Special Air Services, the elite unit of the British military, they sent down a colonel. And this colonel came and he actually studied the layout of the Golden Temple and the surrounding buildings, and he advised them on a plan to what was the best way to capture Bhindranwale in that hostel that he was, Guru Nanak Niwas, that he was staying in. And this was an operation that they rehearsed. They had in fact even created a mock-up of this particular hostel in Sarsawa, which is the base of the special group. The special group is a very secretive elite unit. It reports directly to RNAW. It's under, it's entirely staffed by the Indian Army. It's a battalion-sized special forces unit, but it operates under RNAW. It's a very secretive outfit. In those days, it was trained for counter-terrorist operations. I mean, this is 1983 when you didn't have special forces like the NSG, which were counter-terrorist units. The NSG was in fact set up after that.
I believe some of SG's first operations were in fact done in Assam in the northeast.
Yes. So SG was set up with the assistance of the Israeli military. The IDF trained the first operatives of the special group, the Sayeret Matkal, elite Israeli counter-terrorist units, trained the first SG members. And so the SG was going to be the outfit that would carry out Operation Sundown. And they, like I said, they created this mock-up of the Guru Nanak Niwas and they rehearsed over it. And the operation was to heli-drop onto the roof of this hostel, that you would have commandos coming in 2 Mi-4 helicopters to the roof of this hostel. They would capture Bhindranwale, and then there would be an extraction from the ground, that you would have APCs, armored personnel carriers, that would rush in. They would put Bhindranwale into those APCs and then quickly exfiltrate. That was the plan. And this is what they had rehearsed for over several weeks. But unfortunately, the government, in its wisdom, chose not to greenlight this operation.
And that's because of the casualties that would inevitably take place.
They asked the army unit, that was the SG, what a reasonable assessment of casualties were going to be. And they gave a high figure, which would be something like a quarter of the attacking force that could be potentially knocked out by Bhindranwale's armed detail. They even said that the helicopters could be targeted. So I think the government realized that possibly a commando operation wouldn't be the right choice. And so they went to the Indian Army. And General Sundarji, one of our most legendary army chiefs, was then the Western Army commander. And he promised to rid the Golden Temple of Bhindranwale in a few hours, if not days.
And with no casualties. I think that
with a minimal amount of casualties. Because I think what they had... Sundown was meant to be a surgical operation, that very special forces driven operation. And the Indian Army at that time, this is 40 years back, it didn't have the kind of capability of assaulting, fighting in built up areas, like the kind of expertise that you have today after 4 decades. Fighting in built up area, special forces operations in urban areas was still a very emerging concept in those days, in the early 80s. It was very untried, it was untested. And if you ask me why the SAS, if you remember just 4 years before that, you had the very famous siege of the Iranian embassy, which after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, you had radicals taking the Iranian embassy hostages inside the Iranian embassy. And you had the SAS that staged a fantastic special forces operation, a very precise operation in the middle of a very crowded London suburb. They assaulted the embassy and they freed all the hostages with minimal casualties. So therefore, they reached out to the SAS initially in late 1983. And the person who actually did a lot of the parleying and the back and forth between India and the UK was, no surprise, Ramnath Kao, who was the head of who was special advisor to Prime Minister Gandhi, and he had come back in his second avatar.
This was the man who had founded RAW in the first place.
The founder of the RNAW, and he had, of course, Bangladesh was one of his biggest operations where he trained the Mukti Bahini, and he returned almost a decade after Bangladesh in 1981 as special advisor to Prime Minister Gandhi. And in fact, it was him who came up with this idea for a special forces operation. But then the government decided not to do it. And they said, we'll send the army. And I think that was a grave miscalculation because they anticipated the militants coming out with their hands raised. Who would take on the Indian army? And that decision, the go-ahead for the Indian army to move in was on the 1st of June. And a few days later, the operation began on the 4th of June. And this continued for almost 3 days. And there was intense fighting. And that explains the kind of death toll. Nearly 500 civilians died. Army soldiers died. It was a bloodbath. if you look at it. And it was this operation, the failure of Bluestar, that actually leads people to wonder maybe Sundown would have been a better option, a surgical, precise operation to bring Bhindranwale out of that hostile complex that he was in.
Now cut to 40 years later.
Yes.
Punjab at that point was had just started reaping the benefits of the Green Revolution.
Yes.
It was India's most prosperous state, a state that famously contributed almost 10% of the Indian army, despite being just 2% of the populace.
Yes.
And it was heavily industrialized. Hero, incidentally, comes from there. You had hosiery and
Yes.
a number of things coming. But Punjab today is a far cry from the happy place that it was.
Yes.
And this is despite the fact that India has managed to actually eradicate an insurgency, which in
Yes.
itself is a very difficult proposition. And now we have two avowed Khalistanis, or at least one avowed Khalistani,
Yes.
who is now a member of parliament. How do you see, the next few days or the road ahead for Punjab?
Well, Deepak, the fact is that Punjab, while we may have stamped out militancy, the deindustrialization of Punjab that happened in the militancy years, which is all through the 80s, right up to the mid-90s, a decade of insurgency where, as you correctly pointed out, the most prosperous agricultural breadbasket of India that had a lot of industries located, you saw a flight of capital, you saw a deindustrialization where industrialists were moving their plants and factories away from Punjab. Who wants to invest in a state where you have no security, you have no protection of your business interests? Money is a coward, very simply. Money follows peace, prosperity, stability. That deindustrialization of Punjab that took place in the 80s and right up to the 90s, Punjab has still not recovered from it. So a lot of the problems you see today, which is unemployment, drug addiction, this rootlessness, the youth wanting to leave Punjab and migrate, doing whatever they need to do, become illegal migrants, sell their land. All of this is, I think, a long-term consequence of that havoc that we saw in the 80s and the early 90s. And preachers like Amritpal, Bian Singh's son, who are now in parliament, are a manifestation of that angst that's still there in Punjab. But, quickly a caveat, Deepak. The fact is that while they may be separatists, while they're pursuing a separatist agenda, the fact is that they've both, in some way, espoused their belief in the Indian democratic process. They have not taken arms against the Indian state. They've gone and they've contested elections and they've won Lok Sabha seats, and now at least one of them would be in parliament. So that's a kind of a vindication in the Indian democratic process, that here you have this irony of two people who are espousing separatism choosing to be part of the democratic process.
See, one of the things that's always curious to me is that populist preachers such as, say, Amritpal, they claim to have the panacea for all the ills that plague their society. But if you hear them, everything that they offer is actually quite intangible. And those are intangible ideas that they talk about.
Yes.
They'll talk about izzat and honor.
Yes.
Things that, when Amritpal says that Punjab hasn't been given the respect that it deserves, it's simply impossible to quantify what that means.
Yes.
Right. And so it's an easy question to raise and it's a difficult answer. Now what we've done is, another ironical thing about the same man is that while at one point he had openly stated his desire to secede from India as a union,
yes,
he also felt comfortable enough to participate in the electoral process.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key things when you join this process is actually to reaffirm your belief in the constitution and in that nation.
Yes.
Don't you see a sort of duplicity here?
No, I don't see any duplicity whatsoever. And the short answer to this is the fact that I'm happier looking at both of them being inside the parliament than outside on the streets, rabble rousing and possibly picking up arms against the Union of India. The fact that they are going to be, let's hope, responsible members of parliament in the house, they will have to abide by a set of rules, without which they can't enter the Lok Sabha. So it's good to have people like this join the mainstream. However radical they may be, they've chosen to join the democratic process. and debate their issues in Parliament rather than pick up arms and fight for violent secessionism, which is what the Punjab movement was all about. The terrorism, that phase of Khalistan, terrorism in Punjab was all about for more than a decade. But that's a long discussion there, Deepak. We'll continue it some other time. And 40 years of Operation Bluestar, a military operation that Punjab has not quite recovered from even today.